So I'm going to talk about the legitimate violence of the caliphate. So here I'm talking about an official violence, and I think we spoke about it yesterday with Amal. So nowadays, Islam has been linked to many violent acts all over the world. Many have started to ask themselves whether or not the religion of Islam itself is violent, or at least more violent than the other religions. It is certain that in the Quran, which is believed to be the immaterial and universal word of God, passages that preach violence can be found. Of course, as many scholars say, these passages are subject to interpretations and to social and historical contextualizations. However, the absence of a clear clerical presence in Islam makes it hard to decide which interpretation is or should be more accurate or more true than the other. On the other hand, the vast and rapid expansion of Islam proves that at least the first Muslims did not hesitate to use violence in order to gain power and lands. This violence was not only caused by political decisions, but it always had a religious foundation, a textual foundation, since the community of Muslims was led by a person who pretended to be the successor of the Prophet of Islam, which is the Caliph. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the successor, or the Caliph, ruled all the lands controlled by Islam. The figure of the Caliph not only guaranteed the religious prosperity, but also the political superiority of the new religion. With time, the inner divisions of the Muslim community weakened the reign of the Caliph. First, the schism between Sunni and Shia, and then all the factions inside of the Sunni community have turned the function of the Caliph into a symbolic function with no actual and practical power. During the 11th century, the decline of the caliphate power was mainly caused by the debts that the Caliph owed to the Buyids. This led to the weakening of the Sunni power and the rise of the Shia and the Ismailite influence. The Caliph al-Qadir finally publicly refused the Buyids' view and reaffirmed Hanbalism as the official doctrine of the Caliphate. It is under these circumstances that al-Mawardi, in his famous book Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the ordinance of the government, it was this main goal to restore the caliphate power. Al-Mawardi's main goal was to restore the caliphate power after it was weakened. This explains why some of al-Mawardi's political ideas seems to be utopic, although al-Mawardi does not seem to deny the use of violence, and that it is essential to restore the power of the caliph. In this paper, the concept of violence in al-Mawardi's writings will be examined. In order to do so, the conditions and the means of that violence will be analyzed by studying the concept of the holy war, al-jihad, its definition and its terms concerned according to al-Mawardi. This will lead us to investigate some of the values preached by al-Mawardi, such as obedience and loyalty. And finally, some of al-Mawardi's political ideas, which seems to converge with Machiavelli's philosophy, will be explored. I will start with the jihad concept. Al-Mawardi clearly defined the jihad as the war against the polytheists and mushrikun. The jihad against this kind of people is mainly used in Dar al-Harb, the arena of battle, meaning that the Christians and the Jews living in Dar al-Islam, as dhimmis, are not included, since these people pay the jizya and they are therefore under the protection of Islam. The polytheists living in the arena of battle are two kinds of people. I quote Al-Mawardi, "First, those whom the call of Islam has reached, but they have refused it and have taken up arms. And second, those whom the invitation to Islam has not reached. The difference between the two is crucial. The first category of polytheists is considered as directly dangerous to the Caliph. They should be killed and they may suffer. However, the second category of polytheists are not considered as enemies unless they refuse to convert after proofs of Islam has been given to them. They should not be killed if they simply ignore Islam." It is interesting to see that Al-Mawardi does not absolutely forbid their death. He argues that if they are killed before the true religion can be preached to them, blood money can be paid. That matter remains uncertain, since some scholars, such as Abu Hanifa, say that no blood money should be paid, since after all they died as polytheists. Once again, we see that violence is permitted as long as it aims to protect the Muslim community and the Caliphate's power. Al-Mawardi drew a distinction between the offensive and the defensive jihad. In fact, the offensive jihad, which aims to conquer more lands to add them to Dar al-Islam, is a collective duty. The Ummah, or the Muslim community, should work constantly to expand its lands. This expansion, increasing the Caliphate power, will eventually lead to the dispersion of Dar al-Harb. Once all the land is submitted to the Caliphate power, the Dar al-Harb will naturally disappear and the use of jihad will no longer be relevant. Through this perspective, peace is only reached when all the world comes under the Islamic power. Until then, the Muslim community has the duty to keep fighting. Every Muslim should join the holy war when needed to help to attain this goal. The defensive jihad, on the other hand, seems to be an individual duty. Every Muslim should try to maintain the political and moral order established by the Islamic Caliphate. He should always make sure that he and his family can freely travel in Dar al-Islam. And if the land is being attacked by foreign people, and especially by non-Muslims, he has the duty to defend the land and expel the enemy from it. The Caliph has the duty to defend the Caliphate power, because the whole Muslim community depends on it. Therefore, Al-Mawardi does not take for granted the danger of the apostate. Every Muslim who willingly decided to leave Islam, to convert to a different religion, or who just simply lost his faith in Islam, is dangerous to Islam, and therefore it is legitimate that the Caliph uses violence against him. Nevertheless, individual apostates are treated differently than collective apostates. In other words, apostates living alone in the lands controlled by the Islamic power, who do not have a community of their own, are considered less dangerous than the one who lives in a community of apostates. Individual apostates are somehow isolated from the Ummah. It is forbidden to marry them, eat their food, inherit, or give them any kind of property. They are treated as a lower class of individual living in the Caliphate lands. Al-Mawardi never forbids killing them, however, it is not required to do so. On the other hand, apostates who form a community of their own in the land of the Caliphate are considered to be a threat to the Ummah. They are dealt with as an enemy of Islam. However, since they were once Muslims themselves, it is important to try to lead them back to Islam. Proofs of Islam should be presented to them, and they should be asked to come back to the Ummah. If they decided to do so, they are forgiven. If not, they should be fought and killed. This legal and legitimate violence against the community of the apostate can also be considered as a jihad, since these apostates are seen as enemy of Islam, occupying a part of the lands. Not only those who willingly leave the religion of Islam are considered apostates, but also each Muslim who refused to pay the taxes to the Caliph. In fact, the payment of the tax to the Caliphate is considered to be a religious obligation. The tax has a religious foundation. The third pillar of Islam, al-zakat, is a form of tax on the wealth of the Muslims. Each Muslim has to pay a certain amount of his wealth to the Caliph. This money not only aims to help the Caliphate power to survive and develop, but also intends to support members of the Muslim community who are in need, especially widows and orphans. And here I can remind you that Muhammad himself was an orphan. It is clear that al-Mawardi considers that the use of violence is legitimate to maintain the power of the Caliph. Every person who is seen to be a danger to the central Islamic power should be fought and forced to submit by violence. This is also the case for innovators, al-Bid'ah, who refuse to follow the traditions of the Islamic religion. As long as they pay their taxes and recognize the Caliphate's authority, violence should not be used upon them. However, if they start to rebel and their number increases, they are considered to be enemies of Islam and should be fought. It is interesting to note that in the writings of al-Mawardi, jihad is not only used against an external threat. By the time of Muhammad, the expansion of Islam was essential. It was important to gain new lands and submit them to the new religion. Later on, the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, saw that the expansion are essential to keep the community united. Instead of dealing with inside divisions between the different tribes, the first Caliph saw that finding a common enemy is the best way to unite Muslims. However, by the time of al-Mawardi, the Islamic empire had already expanded. The real struggle was not how to expand further, but how to maintain the community united. That explains why the jihad was used against any person who was a danger to the Caliphate power, Muslim or not. The goal was to maintain unity by maintaining the power of the Caliph. In fact, this unity has strong foundation in the Quran. Allah says several times that the Ummah is the best community that He had ever created. I'm not going to cite the Quran. For this community to stay the best community, it has to be united. This unity is sometimes understood to be not only religious, but also political. The community should be under the rule of one person, just as it was when Muhammad was still alive. It is worth remembering that the Caliph is not supposed to be a political ruler only, but also a religious one. The Caliph is believed to be the successor of the Prophet and ruler of the whole Muslim community. He was called the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen. Thus, he was given religious and political leadership. Divisions, discords, and disunion are considered to be the work of evil. And here the Quran has, I can cite many verses that talk about that. But I'd rather talk about an interesting concept, about death and martyrs. In many passages of the Quran, God invites Muslims to fight the pagans and enemies of Islam. On other occasions, God promises Muslims great rewards for dying for their faith. In fact, the Muslim believe dying in battle for the sake of God is the only way to become a martyr. First, they are promised a great recompense. Of course, they're going to go straight away to paradise without waiting till the end of the world. As for those who are killed in the way of God, He will not, I'm not going to cite the Quran, it's a long quotation, so I'll keep it for the publication. In fact, the word shaheed in Arabic comes from the word shahada, which literally means to witness or to testify. So they are witnesses of the true religion. However, Mawardi has a very interesting way to tackle the issue. While the Quran considers that dying in the cause of God is unconditionally a good thing, the author of Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya places conditions on dying this way. It is worth noting that he believes that a Muslim should not die he should only die if his death is beneficial to the Muslim battle. He gives two conditions. Either that it will incite the Muslim to fight to avenge him, or that it will cause the mushrikun to lose heart on account of his act. Therefore, dying for the faith of God should have only one of the two effects: intimidation of the enemy or boosting the Muslim army. So he puts condition, the Quran never puts condition on it. As previously discussed in Al-Mawardi's work, the use of violence seems totally legitimate against every man who is considered to be a danger to the Caliph reign. The community of Muslims should stay united and safe. I will skip the part to stay on time, but I would like very much to talk about retreating. Based on the Quran, Al-Mawardi notes that it is forbidden for a Muslim to retreat when he is facing polytheists and heretics in battle. And Muslims should always be ready to die for his faith, even if he is outnumbered by the enemy, because God will always give him victory, and the Quran will say so. However, once again, Al-Mawardi places condition on retreating. He finds it unwise and absurd not to retreat if the death of the Muslim fighters will not change the outcome of the battle. However, in this case, he will find a textual base. He will find that the Quran will say himself that if it is outnumbered by 2 times and 3 times, a Muslim can retreat. However, the Hanafi people were saying that a Muslim should die even if he is outnumbered by the other people. It is no surprise that Al-Mawardi, because of his pragmatism, had led him to prefer not to follow the Hanafi opinion on this matter. To conclude, I found it very interesting to see that one can draw parallels between Al-Mawardi's pragmatism and Machiavelli's philosophy. Both considered the state's continuation as an ultimate goal of their philosophy. Al-Mawardi clearly considered that when the caliphate is in danger, the use of violence becomes not only a necessity, but a legitimate behavior that needs no justification. Al-Mawardi does not seem concerned with the moral problem of violence when it comes to the caliphate's survival. However, unlike Machiavelli, Al-Mawardi tries to find always a religious basis for this violence, and the Quran rarely seems to disappoint him. This convergence of opinion between the two authors is very interesting. However, we can always see some points where they do not talk the same thing, especially when it comes to religion. We all know that Machiavelli said that the religion has no place in politics. However, Al-Mawardi's views is a bit different, of course. The rule of Islam should be prosper at all cost. Thus, Al-Mawardi asked the fighters not only to be loyal to their rulers, but also to be obedient. They should trust his judgment and obey to his orders, even if they doubt his decisions. As loyalty appears as the first duty of the fighters toward their ruler, obedience comes second. In fact, the loyalty and obedience that Muslims in general must have towards the Caliph is similar to that which the first Muslims had towards the Prophet. The Caliph is, after all, the successor of the Prophet of Islam himself. While Al-Mawardi does not discuss the concept of al-asma, he finds it doubting the judgment of the caliph and not following his instruction can be catastrophic, religiously and politically. Therefore, we should always follow his orders. To finish, it is interesting that whilst jihad is a legitimate violence, since it is prescribed by God in the Quran, the person of the caliph can also legitimate violence in the name of the power given to him by God. After all, the main duty of the caliph is to protect Islam and to manage political affairs. With reference to the words of Machiavelli, the end justifies the means. The survival of Islam and the prosperity of the caliph's rule justifies the violence used. Thank you.